Okay, so this panel is about WICSE through the decades, and I think um, originally we were going to have one person represented from each of the decades of WICSE, and we sort of have that, but we were going to have a talk from each of them, but we decided a panel would be more fun and hopefully more interactive with the audience. So uh, I'm going to start with letting Paula Hawthorne talk. And each of the panelists, after Paula talks, will introduce themselves.
Okay, now can you hear me? All right. Move on up if you would like. I think that isn't this the last thing we're doing today? No.
I think Diane
There's
is
one
after
more.
us.
One more after this. So the founding WICSE, someone said it must have been hard work. It was not hard work. What we did to found WICSE is, first, every Friday we would have a brown bag lunch in the student lounge in Evans Hall on the 5th floor. And we did that, we women did that, because we needed other women to talk to. Because when you go in a classroom and you are the only woman, it's nice to have another woman to talk to sometime. And because at least one of us, that was me, wasn't a person who could hang out afterward. I had 2 little kids. My 2 little kids meant I had to go pick them up from daycare, and that meant that there was no going and having beer with my friends afterwards. So it was lunch. So we had lunch, many lunches. After a while, we found out that there was money available if we would incorporate ourselves, if we would become a something. And so that was when we went down to Sproul Hall and applied. And that's the only work that was done to start WICSE. No more work other than then, as we sat around, we started thinking about what there was that we needed to do to make it better. I really wish we had had the Me Too movement then. One of the things that made it hard, of course, was the high testosterone in the bottom of Evans Hall, which was where the key punches were and the computer terminals were. And that extremely male atmosphere, probably now in the Me Too movement, people would say something about it. Don't know. I hope so. I also hope that nowadays, if there are instances where women are feeling off-put in their classes, that people feel that they can speak up. What we did with the people when we were having lunch is we would talk about our experiences. If some TA was being over-friendly, that TA's professor was spoken to. We did stand up for each other and try to keep the atmosphere a little less predatory, I'll say. So then, of course, as Barbara told you earlier, we had this conference. Now, do we have the slides, Ken? Elizabeth, do you want to? I want the picture. I want any of them. We had this conference. Now, here we are. The woman on the left was a very interesting woman. I wish Barbara had come back in the room. Sheila, was it? Maria Mann. She was the money and power woman. And she said, what you are after is money and power. And don't ever forget it. Because what you really, women are taught that we're supposed to be the ones that save the world. We're supposed to be the ones that look out for everyone. Don't you believe it? We're out for money and power. And Barbara and I, you see us, we're like, what? We're out for money and power? But listening to her made me understand that there's a whole other thought about how you do this stuff. And it really did help. You can go ahead and, oh, she's gone. Click through the rest of them as you see us. These are actually Sheila's pictures, another one. And you notice Sheila's not in any of these pictures. Sheila was one of the main people who did the conference, and Sheila's not in any of these pictures. I think we look extraordinarily cute. I really do. And you see Sue Graham is there, and I do not remember the other people's names. Maybe you do, Sheila. But But the thing about that conference, what it did for me personally, is it made me see that there is more to life than just trying to get through graduate school. Now, when people say follow your passion, my passion was not to stay in graduate school for 6 years. I would never have recommended that to anyone. The only good part about it was my kids were 2 and 3 when I entered, and 8 and 9 when I got out, which meant that I could do that entire kids getting sick every time they go to school. I could do that without ever having to tell a boss I can't come in, right? Because all I had to do was not go to class. All I had to do was try to get a sub from my TA. Well, that was a little hard. But it was, for me, going to graduate school and having children was just the best life, because that meant I had flexibility. I had the flexibility Leslie talked about earlier, the flexibility that you need in dealing with children and work and so forth. Of course it was hard. Of course there were times when I would move the clocks up so that they would think it was bedtime, so I could then go study after they went to bed. It happened more often than not. But it was also an incredibly wonderful time. It was such a drag trying to get through school. It was wonderful having the WICSE, having the women, having the colleagues. It was wonderful also with my professor, Michael Stonebreaker, who was a pain to deal with. Yes, Margaret, we know, a pain to deal with. But on the other hand, someone asked me, he said, well, we want to know what it was like being a woman working for Mike Stonebreaker. And I said, it was exactly like being a man working for Mike Stonebreaker. It was no different. The man drove you nuts, and it was hard, but you did it. The second thing we did, first we did the conference, and then actually before that, which I wanted to mention as one of the early things that we did at WICSE, was we noticed that there was a low yield of women who were accepted, but then who themselves decided to come to graduate school here. A very low yield. And so we applied for and got money to do a little survey. We sent to the women who said they weren't coming, who had declined UCB's offer of them coming. We sent them a letter with a postcard in it that said, tell me why you didn't come. And it was a huge percentage of them who didn't come because they didn't have any financial help. And I don't mean fellowships. I mean, nobody got fellowships. Hardly anybody got fellowships. But you would at least get a promised TA position. That's why I got to Berkeley, is because I was promised a TA position. I said, oh, I can support myself and the kids. We found out that none of them had gotten, any kind of financial support. TA positions, RA positions, nothing. So then we went back to the professors who were on the committee to decide that. We said, what was the percentage of women who were given that? And the answer was 0. 0. 0. And this is one of those things, it's kind of like the Heisenberg principle that, once you disturb it, once you look at it, once you say, what? Then the professors go, oh, well, we didn't, oh, and the next year, there were far more women. But in doing that, I had this wonderful conversation with Marty Graham, who was a professor here, who said, I've been working with admissions a lot, and the thing is, I am not convinced that having these admission standards that we have really are predicting who is going to be a successful student, right? Who's to say, if you're in computer, if you're in theory, right? Who's to say, if you're in theory, that having a advanced calculus class when you're in high school was as good as having a poetry class that you did really well in? Who's to say that designing a circuit board in your undergraduate was any better predictor of success in designing computer systems than designing a clothing line for your design class. Do you understand? What are the actual predictive factors for success? Which gets you back to what's success, which is a hard thing. I am now done with my timer. That's why I had it in my hand, is because I can talk forever, as you know. The first thing we did was that. The second thing was the conference. And then the third thing, of course, was the reentry program. The reentry program was something that Barbara and Sheila and I worked on for a long time. When we were working on it, my professor, Mike Stonebreaker, said, "Why are you wasting your time? Your job is to get out of school. Why are you wasting your time?" And it's part of what Barbara was talking about earlier, which is when you are the minority, you then get tagged with all these things you're supposed to do, which takes away from the work, right? And you need the work in order to be successful. And that was when Jean Lawler said to us, "It's good that you are doing this. You are learning skills that's going to help you wherever you go. Going into the dean's offices, talking to the deans, going to the professors, talking to the professors, working with Sheila to try to get funding for this program. This will help you for the rest of your life." And I think it actually did. It certainly was effective in getting a lot of women to come to Cal that wouldn't have come before. It's too bad it got shut down by Prop 209, but it did. Okay, so that's more than what I was supposed to be saying, so thank you.
Thanks, Paula. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Becca Roloffs. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Berkeley in the computer science side. I'm advised by Benjamin Recht and Jim Demmel, and I work on machine learning and optimization. And I guess I was actually in charge of organizing the sponsorship for this event, and I did learn from Sheila how to write a formal business email. So hopefully I'll carry that skill through with me for the rest of my life. Yeah, but I'm happy to be here, and I really believe in WICSE as a community. So I'm glad that I can support it.
So Becca had the honor of being asked to do this pretty much yesterday, I think. So we decided that instead of giving individual talks, we wanted to do this as a panel. And so she's our impromptu moderator and leader here. So yay, Becca. So my name is Kim Keaton. I am a distinguished technologist at Hewlett-Packard Labs. And so I graduated with my PhD in '99. I worked with Dave Patterson and Randy Katz while I was here. And my focus has been data management and storage systems in the time when I was a graduate student as well as since then. The work that I'm doing now is a part of the machine program that we have at HPE, which is looking at how to redesign the ways that computers are organized. And so really use building blocks like new technologies like non-volatile memory technologies and photonic interconnects and heterogeneous processing capabilities to organize a system that's going to be more friendly to data analysis types of applications. So we think that there's some great benefits that we can have if we organize things more around the memory rather than around the processing necessarily. And so I guess in terms of my recollections of WICSE, I was one of the WICSE presidents in the mid-90s. I was also involved in the Computer Science Graduate Student Association. And we had a lot of fun, I think. And so that we went on retreats and had an opportunity to really get to know one another. We instituted a review system. We had an opportunity to state a parents' policy and whatnot. And so I think there were a lot of really interesting as well as rewarding things that have happened then. And we also had a chance to meet and get to know one another. And so it's wonderful to see some of my fellow graduate students and to be able to reconnect with them.
Hi, I'm Isabel Stanton. I am a staff software engineer at Google. I work on search quality, which is the team that works on optimizing our ranking. So you type the query, we get you the results, and other things like that. So I've been working on that for a little over 5 years now. And when I was at Berkeley, I graduated in 2012 with my PhD. I was part of the theory group. And it was actually a year and a half before I realized that there was another woman in the theory group. Alex Kola had found, she had been the only woman for quite a while, and then she'd been on working in Princeton, and then she sort of came back, and she turned out she was my office mate. That was why there was an empty desk. And she taught me how to surf while she was writing her dissertation on a surfboard. And then I was the only woman in the theory group for the next 4 years until Salil and Urmila, and there were a couple of other women who joined right as I was finishing. So I think for me, WICSE was actually the only way that I saw other women at all, because I was on the 6th floor, and all of the other women were like in the 4th and the 5th floor. So had it not been for WICSE, I would have just seen the theory group. So that was a really nice thing for me. Yeah, I think the other thing that I wanted to mention, or maybe we'll talk about that later. So I think we're supposed to talk a little bit about what were some of the things that happened in WICSE while we were there. I'm supposed to be representing like modern
we'll get
WICSE.
to that.
We'll get to that.
Okay,
Like,
all right.
like you to introduce yourself.
Great, we'll do that.
Hi, so my name is Gitanjali Swami, and oh my God, they've got me down as founder and chairman of a company which we sold 3 years ago, but that's okay. I've always wondered what I do. If somebody figures out, you should let me know. But the best description I give is I'm a problem solver. I take problems, I solve them, and I build things around them. Oh, right, here we go. Do I have to start again from the beginning? Okay, yeah, good. Okay, so my name is Gitanjali Swami, and they've got my title wrong because they've got me down as somebody with a company we sold 5 years ago, actually. But anyway, nonetheless, I've always tried to figure out what is it I do, and the best answer I can come up with is I'm a problem solver, which is why most recently, even after getting a PhD from Berkeley, I'm working and I worked in private equity. So trying to figure out what the connection between the two is, then fundamentally it's a certain way of thinking. How I got involved with WICSE was kind of funny. I went to an undergraduate school called the Indian Institute of Technology in Kanpur, and we had 6 women and 300 guys in my class. So when I landed up at Berkeley, Sheila says, well, do you think you'd want to be president of WICSE? And we'll make it easy. You can share the role with a co-president. And I was one of the years where we had a co-president. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. They have enough women to have an association. Because that was a novel concept to me, right? So, I think the year we were there, we did, at least I remember it as the era of training. Because I was a great one about looking at problems and then training the women to deal with it. And so what sticks in my mind was we had a whole slew of attacks on women, and so we decided we were going to have a training program to teach women self-defense in WICSE.
I remember that.
You remember that one, right?
Yes.
And I still remember that, the strategy is to kick them in the knees and break the knee first.
And the arch as well.
The arch as well. That was, step on the arch and kick them in the knee. So, it was a wonderful experience, not just because of the amazing women that I got to meet, including Kim, because we overlapped, but also because it was a chance to learn a lot of skills that you weren't necessarily being taught in grad school. Like, for instance, how do you go and beg for extra money to pay the guy who's going to do the self-defense training? But anyway, why did you ask your next question?
Well, my next question was actually what sort of initiatives did WICSE start in your time, which you sort of answered a bit, but more I want to know how you were involved and what impact did it have on the student body? So maybe Kim.
I can start. So one of the things that we've been reminiscing about earlier today, during my time in WICSE, we had a retreat that we held off-site in Bolinas, and Sheila was lovely and offered us the opportunity to stay at her house for a night. And so several of the graduate students, we got together, we did hikes, we walked around. I remember we made spaghetti and we learned salsa lessons. We learned how to dance basically, and really just had a chance to bond as a result of having the chance to get away. And so this opportunity to really have a place where you could let your hair down, literally in some cases, and really have a chance to talk with people was wonderful. One of the other things that we did in the 90s, the mid-90s, was Nikki Murgafori, who's here, and I worked on a two-way feedback system where faculty advisors could provide feedback to students, as well as students could then provide feedback to the faculty as well. So before that, every year you got basically a 2-line printed printed letter that basically told you whether you were doing really well, or whether you needed to improve, or whether you needed to take your next exam, that sort of thing. So really low signal in terms of how well you were doing. And so we thought that it made a lot of sense to actually give people more concrete information about what are you doing well, what should you be working on, what are some concrete ideas for how you could actually go about improving those skill sets and acquiring new skill sets. And so this was an opportunity for you to have a more structured conversation around that. Kind of like, if you have a good relationship with your advisor, you should be able to have those kinds of conversations anyway. This was like a really sort of a forcing function to have that conversation. I kind of liken it to the excuse of having Valentine's Day, so that at least you get a card and flowers once a year, as opposed to sort of the ongoing kind of a thing. But so it was great to be able to get that additional information and have that conversation to get feedback about what you were doing. But it was also a good opportunity then for you to say what you needed from your faculty advisor. And so, again, if you have a good relationship, it's really easy to have those kinds of conversations and to ask for the kinds of things that you need. But in some cases, the faculty advisor is somebody who wrote the book on the subject, or is like a fellow of all of the different societies, like all of them, and all these national engineering, and so it can be very intimidating to say to someone that I need more than what you're giving me. And so this was also an opportunity to try and provide some more structure for that kind of a conversation as well, so that hopefully it wasn't quite so scary. You had some questions that you could just answer more directly. And so I looked on the website, and there are some of those questions are still there in terms of things that people, so I don't know if this is something that people are still doing, but if not, I highly recommend it. It's a really great way to have a more structured conversation.
So I had a couple of things. I actually was not a WICSE president or really involved in WICSE aside from I just went to the lunches. So I was CSGSA president instead, and I think everyone else is a WICSE president. So I will just talk about.
I was not.
You were not. Okay. I will talk about some things that some other people did while I was a student there. So I think the first thing that came to mind was that Katya Gonina and Aaron Carson, I guess, raised too much money, and so they started this thing at the end of
good problem to have.
Right. So in 2009, maybe, we had our first fancy cocktail party, and so I think that's still something that's going on today. It was certainly still around when I graduated, which I hear is something that people have really enjoyed, of like this one time a year for everyone to dress up and bring their date and just kind of have a nice fancy party together. But more on like the more serious side, actually, Colleen and Florine started CS Kickstart, which was something to allow incoming freshmen to do a week of catch up, like a boot camp, so that way incoming freshman women were able to get some of the background that they may be missing. And then also, I think the Stanford Berkeley meetup started while I was a student there, and I think that's still ongoing as well. So it seemed like there was a couple of these initiatives set up that were outreach oriented. And I think Kristen Steven might have started Craft Night because she wanted to teach everyone how to crochet. So there was like a wide variety of things that were social events and also things that were volunteering and outreach that were started but after 2008.
Paula,
I thought I just answered that
oh,
question.
Gita,
So
that's fine.
I get a free pass, don't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I have another thing that I wanted to share. So would you go ahead?
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so one of the other things that happened in the 90s, I wasn't directly involved in it, but it was an important thing, and so I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned it. There was a lot of activity on parental policies and whatnot, and so there was, Ginger Ogle started a listserv that basically allowed parents to talk to one another about various issues around parenting and balancing being a parent and being a graduate student. And it started rather small within the department, but then has gradually grown over the years, and I think there were thousands of members, at last I checked, and so that was one of the things that happened in the space of sort of parent graduate students. And then the other was several students, Caroline Tyson, Sohail Labana, and Humadar, also then proposed a parental leave policy. And so, faculty and staff had the opportunity to, have reduced sort of work activities and whatnot while they were dealing with, with young children and maternity leave and whatnot. And so, but that same benefit wasn't really accorded to students. And so, so this was an attempt to actually allow students to sort of stop the clock on various kinds of exams, like prelim exams, qualifying exams, and whatnot, to potentially have reduced teaching load and whatnot. And so, it was proposed to the faculty and became a part of the policies of the department, and I gather that it's even been sort of adopted more broadly across campus since then. So that was another important thing that happened in the 90s.
Okay, I think I'll ask the next question, which is that I'm a graduate student, and there are many of my fellow graduate students in the audience. So what we want to know is, what were the life lessons that you learned as a graduate student in your time here?
So for me, it was the value of not giving up. I would want to give up, and Barbara wouldn't let me. Barbara would say, you can't go back to Texas because that would reduce the number of women in this department by whatever it was, 20%. I think we were always 5 women. You can't leave. And so sticking it out, just doing it, getting it done, and finally getting that PhD. And the earning of the PhD for me meant having overcome a lot of obstacles and having something in my hand that said, no matter the fact that she talks a lot like a Southerner, no matter the fact that she's a rather round woman, she's smart, and you have to pay attention to her. And I was telling Barbara today, I will throw it down every once in a while now. I'll be in a meeting with city council people. I now am retired and I volunteer for gun violence prevention. I'll be in a meeting with city council people and I will say, well, it's true that my PhD is in electrical engineering and computer science from Cal, but still I do know something about whatever it is.
Yeah.
And people sit up. People sit up, and you'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but having done that, first of all, you don't get out of here with a PhD without knowing what you're talking about. I mean, that is absolutely true. I mean, when I say I am an expert, the fact is I am an expert. I couldn't have graduated. And then the second thing is, it is your entree. People now know, without a doubt, that you are a very smart person, which, you know, for somebody like me, you kind of need that.
For me, I guess I learned a couple of things. One of them was sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And so that was a very early lesson, which I think comes back in many different ways. I guess really what it's more about is just taking initiative and not necessarily waiting to have someone ask you to do something. And people really value and reward initiative. And you know, if something isn't quite happening, so you know, I work in research, and sometimes there are just, you know, sort of very ill-defined questions. And so if I can then, you know, sort of take that step and say, well, okay, here I think is the set of 5 questions that we really need to be answering. And then you can help to almost frame the issue and really, you know, set up a conversation so that it can be had. Whereas, you know, people might be lost in terms of trying to figure that out. So that's just one example from my current life where I feel like asking forgiveness rather than permission is, you know, is a really valuable skill. Another valuable lesson was that sometimes selective incompetence is its own reward. And so there was a question earlier about, you know, how do I get out of doing all these things that, you know, I don't want to do, like taking notes or organizing this or getting lunch. So actually, it was the getting lunch thing. We used to have research group meetings, and we took turns getting lunch for the research group meeting. And I remember one of my colleagues, Eric Anderson, Randy is shaking her head, so yeah, so she remembers these kinds of things. But at any rate, so Eric Anderson thought that it was silly to have to go get lunch, and so he thought, what's the worst possible thing that I can get for lunch so that they never ask me to do it again? And so he went to McDonald's and he got like a bunch of just, you know, like cheeseburgers and hamburgers. But, you know, it was fine, right? You know, but people hated it so much that no one ever asked him to get lunch again. So Dave is here. So Dave remembers this absolutely, yeah. And so it was great. And so then the final sort of. Oh yeah, did you know that? Yeah, he hated it. See, then sort of on the other side of this, then there are people that, you know, view this as an opportunity to show people their wonderful culinary skills, right? You know, so I remember at one point, Erin brought in risotto, 3 different kinds of risotto, and we're like, didn't you have work to do this week? You spent all your time in the kitchen. So that was definitely another one of the lessons. And then a third lesson was really around some observations that I had learned about when I first started. And so Susan Eggers was someone who was an architecture student well before I got here. But you know, she really spoke to this question about, you know, speaking up in class and asking questions and whatnot. And she recognized that many of her male students, so she came back to school a little bit later than the average student. And she noticed that many of her fellow students were young men. And so she called these people the young male talkers. They talked all the time, and they would always, offer suggestions or always ask questions and whatnot. And so, her way of dealing with this was, she basically said, you have to know when to play by the rules, you have to know when to break the rules, and then sometimes you have to know when to change the rules. And so I thought that was a really, really useful piece of advice, just in terms of trying to understand, how to play the system, or how to operate in the confines of the system, and then also knowing when to change the system. And so that was a really powerful lesson, I thought.
I had something just pretty small. So I did my PhD in theory. Before that, I was a math major, and then I became a software engineer at Google, having written about 2,000 lines of Python in my life. And so I did not know how to code. And I didn't know how to code at Google, and nobody knows how to code at Google because everything is internal, and you shouldn't really know how to code at Google. And so what I did the entire first year was I just repeated in my head, I have a PhD, I'm smart. There's no reason I should know how to do this, I'll figure it out. And so I just found that sense of accomplishment really helped with my confidence to get me through that kind of imposter syndrome.
So I actually wrote this down in case I forget it, right?
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so the hardest thing for an atypical thinker to understand is that a single voice, however loud and persistent, will eventually get silenced. But a group of voices that persist indefinitely and can persist indefinitely as long as they have right on their side. Now, what's the connection between this and WICSE and getting a PhD and whatnot? Well, that was the whole point. Until I came to Berkeley and until WICSE, I didn't realize that you don't have to do everything yourself. In fact, the best way to get public good is for each one of us to do a small amount, not a lot, just a small amount. And if each of us pushes the ball forward just that little bit, we can move the world. And that's something that and I think to some extent as women engineers, we don't necessarily recognize this lesson. So we end up working harder, doing a lot more things, but not understanding the power of a group. And so at WICSE, for instance, it was getting all the women together, and everybody brought lunch on a different day. I remember when I was in the CAD group. So what I spent my first couple of years doing was organizing about 50 researchers over 3 different universities to turn out a piece of code to do verification and synthesis. If each of us had tried to do that by ourselves, we would have been overwhelmed. But we sort of got together and we said, and I found that was kind of one of my talents, was to go there and say, oh, that's the big vision of what we need to do. Okay, let's see who we can go and con into working on this just a little bit. So I think that's a lesson that a lot of women should learn, because we do not realize our potential for leadership and for impact and for change by distributing it and engaging a lot more people.
Thanks. So we're at the time when we're supposed to move to the next session. I don't know if we want to just move to the next session or take maybe one more audience question. One audience question? Okay, Alice says we can take one audience question. So if anybody has a question for our panelists, we'd love to hear it. Yeah, Regina.
So now that you've obviously gone and done other things after being here and being in WICSE, are there things that you've seen in the places that you've gone that you think if you came back and were to tell WICSE one thing that they could do that would be super helpful? Can you think of something that would be?
So actually, I do come back, and in fact, I assume the rest of you do too. I mean, I'm surely not the only person who Sheila has my email. And so I have often come back and talked to the WICSE people, often maybe once every 2 or 3 years, something like that. And actually, what people like when I talk, and someone came up to me today and said, "Oh, I remember when you told us this." And what I was talking about was when you interview, and that women interviewing with me, because I ran the software development groups in startups for many years. When women would interview with me, it'd be like they would be far too trusting pay me whatever you think I'm worth. I just had to tell them I'm not your mama, you know? I'm a hiring manager. And my job is to make sure that I have, make my budget. And that's my first job. My first job is not necessarily to be your mom. And so you want someone to be your mom, go find your mom, right? Or someone else to help you do your research, find out what this job pays. But don't treat me like I'm the parent, right? And actually, I found a lot of women that thought that was helpful. But we do, I mean, I think people do come back and talk to WICSE.
That was actually one thing that we had done as the CSGSA, was starting a survey of everyone tell us what your internships are paying you, so that way people could figure out what they should actually be getting. I'm actually going to answer the question in the exact opposite direction, which is to say, what can you take from WICSE out into the world? I realized that there was about 7 or 8 women in my team of 150, and actually none of us were really working with anyone else. So I decided, I know what to do about this. I've seen WICSE, we'll just have lunch every other week. But it turns out at Google, lunch is free, so that wasn't really all that enticing. And actually just yesterday, I flipped the format, and now we're doing wine and cheese every month. And so I think you will go out in the world and find that you actually need WICSE wherever you are as well. And you should be empowered to change the format and like play around with the lessons that you have right now and figure out how to make a community for yourself wherever you go.
That's a great note to end, and let's thank our panel.